There's knockout power, and then there's George Foreman. Not the kind of power that just ends fights, the kind that ends careers. One shot. Boom. People love to say he was just big, just naturally strong. Like the power in those fists was some kind of accident. But ask anyone who saw him train up close, that power wasn't just there. It was built. Rep by rep, day by day. Sweat, pressure, repetition, until every punch felt like a wrecking ball. He didn't train like an athlete. He trained like a man preparing for war. So today, we're going deep. Not just into George Foreman's highlights or knockout reels. We're going into the work, the grind, the wood chips flying, the heavy bag dents, the miles of road work in silence. We'll look at how a poor kid from Houston turned himself into one of the most feared punchers in history, and how 20 years later, with a belly and a smile, he came back and did it again, knocking out men young enough to be his sons. Welcome to Back to Boxing. George Foreman's journey to becoming a boxing icon started in the gritty streets of Houston, Texas. Born on January 10, 1949 in Marshall, Texas, George was raised in Houston's Fifth Ward, a neighborhood where poverty and crime were part of daily life. One of 7 children, he grew up in a tough environment, often getting into trouble. As a teenager, George was a street tough, dropping out of school at 15, running with gangs, and settling disputes with his fists. Those early brawls, though, revealed something special. Raw, natural power that made people take notice. At 16, everything changed when George joined the Job Corps in 1965, a federal program designed to give young people skills and a fresh start. Stationed in Oregon, he met Doc Broadus, a counselor and boxing enthusiast who saw potential in George's 6'3" frame and raw strength. Initially, George dreamed of playing football, but Doc convinced him to try boxing. His first swings in the gym were wild and unpolished, but they carried a force that stunned his coaches. George wasn't just strong, he was a natural-born puncher. By 1966, George was competing in amateur tournaments, using his size and power to overwhelm opponents. His style was raw but effective, relying on brute force rather than finesse. In 1967, he won the National Golden Gloves, a major stepping stone, and in 1968, at just 19, he represented the US at the Mexico City Olympics. There, he steamrolled the heavyweight division, knocking out opponents and clinching the gold medal. That iconic moment when he waved a small American flag in the ring, it wasn't just a celebration, it was a statement of confidence from a kid who'd come from nothing. George's amateur career, with a record of around 22-4, gave him a crash course in discipline and ringcraft. When he turned pro in 1969, he brought that raw power with him, but he needed a training system to refine it into something unstoppable. Let's dive into the heart of this video, how George Foreman trained to turn his punches into weapons of mass destruction. The training that built a beast. George Foreman wasn't just born with freakish knockout power. He built it, blow by blow, brick by brick, sweat by sweat. Under the unblinking eyes of legends like Dick Sadler and Archie Moore, George took raw strength and carved it into one of the most dangerous weapons the boxing world has ever seen. His training wasn't glamorous, it wasn't modern, it was old school, punishing and brutally effective. The kind of work that doesn't just shape a fighter, it forges one. Old school strength training. In an age before high-tech gyms and performance coaches, George trained like a man preparing for war, not a boxing match. One of his go-to workouts, chopping wood. Not for aesthetics, not for Instagram, but for power. Swinging an axe over and over under the burning Texas sun wasn't just hard, it was relentless. Every motion lit up his shoulders, back, legs and core, the same muscles he used to end fights in one punch. His hands blistered. His shirt clung to his soaked skin. But George kept swinging, because this wasn't just exercise, it was transformation. He stacked that with brutal bodyweight training, sets of 100 push-ups, not for a beach body, but to build fast twitch knockout force, pull-ups, dips, core work, day in, day out, until his entire upper body became a delivery system for destruction. And then there was the crazy stuff. George pulled jeeps with a rope strapped to his waist. He carried a cow on his shoulders across fields. It wasn't pretty, but it made him powerful. These weren't workouts, these were trials by fire. The kind of raw, back-breaking strength training that built a man who could knock you out with a single effortless-looking punch. heavy bag work. When George hit the heavy bag, it wasn't a drill, it was destruction. He'd spend up to 15 rounds pounding away on a 150-pound bag. His punches didn't echo, they boomed. Gil Clancy, his coach, said when George hit the bag, it moved like a wrecking ball. But it wasn't just about power, it was about control, about precision, about imposing punishment with every strike. His jab, just his jab, felt like most fighters' right hands. He didn't flick it, he drove it like a battering ram. To dial in his accuracy, George's trainer would hold the bag steady, letting it swing just enough to mimic a moving target. Every punch had to land straight into resistance, just like it would in the ring. Some of the bags were filled with sand or water, mimicking the dense feel of a human body. That's why when he connected, it didn't just hurt, it devastated. Ken Norton once said getting hit by George was like getting hit by a truck. It wasn't exaggeration, it was the truth. Sparring, for George, sparring wasn't friendly. It wasn't light, it was war. He'd go hard for 8 to 12 rounds, sometimes with fresh opponents rotating in just to keep the pressure sky high. These weren't play sessions, they were survival drills. He learned to cut off the ring with slow, stalking steps, to corner opponents and take away their escape, to feint, bait and strike when the opening came. The result? His legendary demolition of Joe Frazier in 1973, 6 knockdowns in 2 rounds. That wasn't luck. That was built in the gym. That was the product of 1,000 rounds behind closed doors, where he learned how to hurt, how to finish, how to break men. Conditioning, George's power was scary, but what made it terrifying was that it never seemed to run out. He trained for 15-round fights like they were casual jogs. Mornings often started with long runs, 5 to 10 miles, sometimes in steel-toed boots. Not because it was comfortable, but because it built legs that wouldn't quit. His road work was unpredictable. He'd mix long, steady runs with sudden sprints, just like the pace of a fight. Slow, fast, slow again, then boom, an explosion. Jump rope was a daily tool, 15-20 minutes non-stop, sharpening his timing, his rhythm, his coordination. George didn't dance like Ali, but he didn't have to. He just needed enough movement to get close, and once he was close, it was game over. Shadowboxing gave him mental reps, 10, sometimes 15 rounds in front of a mirror, visualizing the fight, tightening every movement, drilling calm under pressure. No crowd, no lights. Just George and the image of the man he was going to destroy. Fuel and recovery. George didn't follow a science-based diet plan. He ate like a machine designed for battle. Steak, chicken, eggs, fish, protein to rebuild what the gym tore down. Oatmeal, rice, sweet potatoes, carbs to keep the engine running. He fought at 220 to 230 pounds of thick, functional muscle, not for looks, but for damage. Recovery was part of the process too. Ice baths to reduce inflammation. Massage to keep the body loose. Sleep, real sleep, 8 to 10 hours a night to heal and reset. George trained to outlast pain, time, and anyone standing across from him. The mindset. The last and maybe most frightening piece of George's training was his presence. Even before the first bell rang, he had an aura. A quiet, brooding stillness. He didn't talk trash. He didn't play games. He just looked at you, calm, unshaken, and you could feel the storm coming. He trained that mindset. He practiced silence, practiced composure, practiced how to look like nothing bothered him, even when everything hurt. Later in life, George would become known for his warmth, his smile, his faith. But young George, he was pure menace. A man who trained not just to beat you, but to make you question if you belonged in the ring with him. Sparring partners said there was a tension in the air when he stepped between the ropes. You didn't just face George Foreman, you survived him. George Foreman didn't get lucky. He didn't lean on talent. He worked. Every drop of sweat, every log split in the heat, every round on the heavy bag, every quiet hour in front of the mirror. It all built the fighter who would one day shock the world and claim the heavyweight crown, not once, but twice. Not through flash, not through finesse, but through fire, through grit, through the kind of training that breaks most men and made one of the greatest heavyweights who ever lived. Championship dominance. January 22nd, 1973, Kingston, Jamaica. The boxing world was on the edge of its seat. George Foreman was about to step into the ring with the undefeated heavyweight champion, Smokin' Joe Frazier. What followed would forever change the landscape of heavyweight boxing. George's training camp for the Frazier fight was unlike anything he'd experienced before. This wasn't just about conditioning, it was about preparing for a battlefield. Under the guidance of trainer Dick Sadler, everything was built around one principle: unleash overwhelming force from the very first bell. Frazier was relentless, durable and dangerous, and George had to be more than ready. He had to be ruthless. The sparring sessions were grueling. Southpaw fighters were brought in to imitate Frazier's pressure and style. But more than physical sparring, George's transformation was mental. He had to tap into a deeper, more ferocious instinct. And when fight night came, it showed. Frazier hit the canvas 6 times in under 2 rounds. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. But George's journey didn't stop there. His next test came in March 1974 against Ken Norton, a completely different kind of challenge. Norton was a technical, awkward fighter, the man who had once broken Muhammad Ali's jaw. Beating him would require a new level of tactical discipline. For Norton, George had to rewire his approach. The training camp emphasized patience, rhythm, and precision. No more just throwing haymakers. The heavy bag work shifted to structured combinations aimed at slowly dismantling Norton's unique defense. That preparation paid off. When the bell rang, George didn't just bulldoze Norton, he outthought him. In the second round, a precisely timed uppercut, honed through repetition in training, landed clean. Norton never recovered. Then came the ultimate challenge: Muhammad Ali. Their clash in Zaire, the infamous Rumble in the Jungle, would test George like never before. Ali wasn't just a boxer, he was a master of psychological warfare. The camp focused heavily on keeping George mentally sharp, emotionally steady, and resistant to the rope-a-dope strategy Ali had perfected. Despite all the preparation, Zaire didn't go George's way. Ali's mind games worked, and Foreman walked away with his first professional defeat. But that fight taught him a deeper truth. Greatness in the ring isn't just about strength or skill, it's about mental resilience, a lesson he would carry for the rest of his career. The legend lives on. George Foreman's story doesn't end with his early days in the ring. In many ways, it only got more impressive later on. When he made his comeback in 1987 after a decade away, he was 38 years old and carrying an extra 50 pounds. Most people in the boxing world dismissed him. They thought it was a joke. What they didn't see coming was the training philosophy he'd quietly developed during those years away. Foreman didn't train like the young man he once was, but that didn't mean he trained any less. He knew he couldn't depend on raw athleticism anymore, so he adapted. He trained smarter. He focused on efficiency, precision, and control. His goal was simple: to get the most out of every movement without wasting a drop of energy. His sessions with the heavy bag turned into a kind of disciplined art form. Each punch had a purpose. Every jab was sharp and deliberate. His legendary power hadn't disappeared. It had simply been refined. He chopped wood for hours. He wasn't chasing a second act. He was rewriting the whole story. It wasn't about proving the doubters wrong anymore. It was about proving to himself that he still had something to give. But the biggest shift wasn't just physical. It was mental. Foreman had grown into a tactician. He studied his opponents like a chess master studying a board. He broke down their habits, spotted their weaknesses, and built game plans tailored to expose them. His preparation was as much mental as it was physical. All of that came to a head on November 5th, 1994. At 45 years old, George Foreman stunned the world by knocking out Michael Moorer and becoming the oldest heavyweight champion in history. That right hand, a clean, sudden shot that seemed to appear out of thin air, wasn't just a punch. It was the result of years of refinement, discipline, and accumulated wisdom. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was the result of a man who had mastered the craft and trusted the process, even when no one else did. That moment didn't just win him a title. It proved a point. With the right training, age doesn't have to be a limit. Skill can beat speed. Strategy can beat strength. Experience can outmatch youth. Foreman's approach to training still echoes through gyms today. His methods for building punching power, his belief in blending mental focus with physical preparation, these are now pillars in modern boxing programs. But maybe the most lasting takeaway from his journey is this: Champions aren't simply born, they're made. Every thunderous punch he threw came from hours of focused practice. Every win was built on a foundation of discipline. Every highlight reel moment was the end result of quiet, relentless work. He didn't just come back, he came back with purpose, and that made all the difference. George Foreman didn't just learn to punch hard, he learned to punch with meaning. And in doing so, he showed us all that with the right mindset and preparation, there's no such thing as a dream that's too big or a fighter too old. His training legacy is still alive, still teaching, still inspiring. Because greatness doesn't just happen, it's built, it's earned, one punch at a time. And that's the complete story of how George Foreman trained to become one of the most devastating punchers in boxing history. From the streets of Houston to the pinnacle of the sport, every step of his journey was defined by an uncompromising commitment to training excellence. Rest in peace, champ. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the methods that created a legend. If you enjoyed this exploration of boxing training, make sure to subscribe and let me know what do you think about this. I will see you in the next one.